How to dominate your league with zero RB in 2022. That's what we're talking about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find my newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work over at RotoViz. Shawn, you've been writing about breakout receivers. We'll be talking about breakout receivers because that's how you dominate, at least one element of how you dominate with zero RB. Zero RB has died every single year, every offseason. I'm not quite sure if it's dead or alive right now. I'm pretty sure only anchor running back is allowed to be done, or double anchor running back, even though those formerly robust RB drafters have conveniently pivoted to these anchor RB builds where they now start to hammer wide receivers and then are still acting like zero RB never got it. That's obviously something that we have talked about as it relates to zero RB for many years, not necessarily on this show. You have talked about it for a long, long time. That's where the modified zero RB name comes in, and that whole debate about modified zero RB versus anchor RB. It's because you were talking about that exact type of build with the rise of the Uber backs a couple of years before anyone was saying anchor RB, and that's what you started to call it, modified zero RB. Again, don't really need to piss off too many people, but how are you doing, Shawn?
I'm doing great. I've had a chance to do a bunch of really fun drafts in the last couple of weeks. I have a lot coming up in the next 7 to 10 days. We have all of these drafts before the Thursday night opener, and then we've got some fantastic FFPC main event drafts and other drafts after that game where you get a little intel from Thursday night. Those drafts are always fun to see where the Thursday night stars go. If you decide to add one onto your own team, if you think you can benefit a little bit from having some guys push down. If we get Gabriel Davis in round one, are we going to get Gabriel Davis in round one? Are you going to have 150 yards, 2 touchdowns, and be a round one pick on Friday and Saturday?
That seems very plausible. I mean, he's risen so much. He went 303, I think it was, in my draft last night. If he has a big game week one, yeah. I mean, he's definitely going. I mean, he's probably wide receiver 4. Right? Well, depends on what Diggs does. Maybe Diggs has a big game too, but he might go at the end of round 4, or excuse me, at the end of round 1 as wide receiver 4. That wouldn't be shocking with the amount of excitement that's already there for him if he then had that big game before those final drafts.
And he's one of a handful of extremely fun young wide receivers who are now in that late third to mostly fourth and through the middle of the fifth in drafts. One of the things I'm very comfortable doing at this point is selecting the first of those receivers actually in the third round, because one of the things that we deal with here is that you only get one pick in the fourth round, right? So you can't get multiple of those guys, even if you think that they're, it's better to obviously not get them well above ADP. You priced yourself out a little bit. That's been one of my arguments for someone like Michael Pittman, is that if drafters are mostly buying the upside scenario anyway, then you haven't left yourself a lot of room to maneuver. But if you like those guys as much or more than the players who are actually going in the third round, give yourself a little bit of that flexibility, give yourself maybe a build that is slightly more unique. We know within the context of these big tournaments that, you're not going to be the only person who decided to reach on that one player.
Yeah.
But yet you're going to have a lot of other guys that you draft onto your team. So within that context, it's going to make you a little bit more unique. Then one of the things that has happened a lot for me recently is that as we've gotten closer to the season, we've gotten a feel for how some of these passing games are going to work. We've gotten a feel for how ADP is going to develop. We definitely now have a sense of where the really good running back values are. Number one, in that, say, round 9 through round 12 range. We did our dead zone show, and you talked about, really kind of pushing that group of running backs that you're avoiding, probably at least to the edge of the 9th round, maybe beyond that to round 10. And then in addition, we now have a second group that we can feel a lot more comfortable with in that round, say 15 to 20 range. And having a lot of guys we like there changes the equation too. When you're drafting early in the offseason, when you're drafting in the summer, you don't have a good feel for who your favorite targets are in that range, and you can't fill out your draft. Then I think you have to make some different choices. You also have a situation where you feel very strongly that a handful of running backs are going to get much more expensive. So when you're doing a hyper fragile build and taking, say, 3 in a row or 3 in the top 5 rounds, you're targeting those backs that you think are going to rise. Now, it doesn't always happen. Sometimes the injury news stays a little bit tricky, like for someone like J.K. Dobbins. But I was very comfortable drafting hyper fragile, not on every team, but as I try and split my exposures between zero running back, modified or anchor running back, however you want to look at it, and hyper fragile, I like to get the hyper fragile teams at that time period. Over the last couple of weeks, basically every draft that I've done has been zero RB because the wide receiver avalanche is so real. The wide receiver value shuts off like you're turning off a tap once you get to that wide receiver 45-ish range. And almost every player you want after that is an RB. So when I did an underdog draft that I wrote about for the site, talking about the most fun draft you could do, and maybe even bringing in some principles from more recreational drafters and some of the advantages they actually have over experts, how do you make that draft work out? It was a zero RB draft. And then the article that went up today talking about my number one target or the best pick in every round, that wasn't necessarily a draft in and of itself, but it did come out to be very zero RB oriented. So I guess the first question I would have for you is, have you had any sort of similar development of how you're drafting, and or do you feel comfortable now with zero RB drafts? Is it your preferred way to do it, or one of your preferred ways to do it as we get into the heart of draft season? Obviously, this is the biggest weekend in all of fantasy for drafts.
I think what you hit on with the 4th and 5th rounds starting to really solidify. We talked earlier in the offseason that those weren't necessarily the same strength of, receiver profile that we had seen in the past. Last year, obviously, round 4 was just an absolute gold mine of options at wide receiver. The 5th round, sort of similar. 3rd round, that range. I feel like as ADP is settled, I feel a lot better about a lot of those names. We talked a little bit about Gabriel Davis, gotten really excited about getting as much Deontay Johnson as I can get, who you and I have talked a lot about. Jalen Waddle with his injury stuff has now started to slide a little bit and gets pushed into that 4th round range. Amon-Ra St. Brown, you've gotten me a little bit more excited about Jerry Jeudy in our conversations. You go into the next group, the year 2 guys, the Batemans, the Elijah Moores. Even, Bateman was a guy I wasn't super excited about in our conversations about how the number 2 receivers there have not stayed healthy, and also with some concern about J.K. Dobbins. I mean, they're going to come out throwing. Bateman's going to get off to a hot start. And so that's been something that has really got me more excited about him. Elijah Moore, Devonta Smith, the rookies. I mean, Drake London in particular, really looking like he's going to come out and play really well. There's a lot of names into that, 5-6 round range. But like you said, at a certain point, things really die down. And it to me, has felt like it's when you get to those rookies. I mean, you get to the Sky Moore, Garrett Wilson, Treylon Burks area. Burks falling for a while, has risen back again now. The final preseason game obviously played a little bit with the ones more. We've also seen George Pickens rise up into that range in a lot of main events. We've seen Romeo Doubs rise up into that range, right at the back end. Jahan Dotson, not necessarily rising a ton, but right in that range sort of throughout as the last sort of rookie. Earlier, I would have said that, the close of the wide receiver window was more like Garrett Wilson. Now, to me, it's, because Wilson was often the cheapest of that Sky Moore, Treylon Burks group. Now it sort of depends when Pickens and Dobbs and Dotson go off. They're kind of like an area where you can still hit on some rookie upside if you are in a very wide receiver heavy draft. Rondell Moore is in that sort of transitional area, maybe. But, I mean, those guys are definitely shakier profiles than, even the Elijah Moore group and Rashad Bateman group, who are definitely shakier profiles than going all the way back up to, round 3, round 4. it's not a scenario where you can just hit on only those last receivers before you feel like things really dry up. But this idea that as things have crystallized, that makes zero RB more viable, I think is pretty perfect. It's very dependent on draft slot. Certainly at the 1 and 2, I'm still very willing to consider McCaffrey or Taylor and do something that's a little bit more, anchor, and then start hammering the receivers. If you're in the 3 to 5 range and you're getting a Cup or a Jefferson or Chase, that's so easy. At the end of the first round, I have had a tough time with the Lamb, Diggs, Adams group. So I want to talk to you about that in terms of actually going zero RB in the back of the first round, if you've come around on those 3 being targets there, or if it's, certainly Pitts and Andrews are in play there in the tight end premium formats. And the non-tight end premium, I know you're not super in on Kelsey, but a lot of people would have the option probably to take Kelsey right at the 1-2 turn. And there are running backs that I'm willing to consider there. Saquon Barkley is now starting to go like 8th overall in a lot of the main events. So he hasn't, we for a while we're able to get him in the 3rd, and then late 2nd, and then early 2nd, and now it's more like you got to take him in the 1st. DeAndre Swift in that range. There are some running backs in that range that I think you can consider. So maybe even starting running back, tight end. So when we talk about the true zero RB, to me, it's a little dependent on who that first round wide receiver is and where you're taking him. Again, Kupp, Jefferson, Chase are really easy picks, and that I think can really lead you into a zero RB build. But very strongly with you on the idea that the 3rd round, the 4th round, the 5th round, the 6th round, I just want to be taking receivers.
And you mentioned some of those ADPs. I have just the last 3 days of FBG and main events at the FFPC up. We talk about these a lot. Obviously, we're doing some of these drafts. I also like to talk about it because I think it's pretty easily generalizable to many of the drafts our listeners are doing. If you're doing drafts that are not tight end premium, the main thing is just to kind of move the tight ends down a little bit. Then I haven't been on Travis Kelce, but in that most fun ever draft, I had the 6th spot. Austin Eckler was taken 5th. I was able to get Chase, and then Travis Kelce fell back to me at the 207. I'm sure that's not the only time that that's happened, but that is somewhat rare. I did grab up Kelce to go with Chase in that fun build, and then ended up with Gabriel Davis, Joe Burrow, and some other fun mixes to play Broncos, Chiefs, and to play Bears, Lions, which this is probably just one of those personal things you have to always know. And I try to make very clear, Ben, you and I make clear players and teams that we have some bias on. I love the Lions. I like Justin Fields. I think the fact that they play in week 17 is kind of fun, and that could be a real shootout. So I'm not against having Bears and Lions on the squad. You talk about the way that the draft falls out in the first round and how that sort of dictates everything else. One of the elements about like that 2013 team with Jamal Charles and how that worked, and there was the weird controversy about, writing about zero RB, but then taking Jamal Charles, missing the fact that so much of this is based on the different contingencies. So when we think about the role that RotoViz has played in the development of draft tactics and big picture draft strategy over the years, I think that's the part that sometimes gets lost in discussion of sort of fun terms. And I certainly take my share of responsibility for that, for giving a name that did stick, but also ends up, being distracting at times. When we're looking at these early selections, we're trying to get exposure or access to these really high scores, building around that with a lot of receivers, but also these receiver profiles that have the upside that we need to win tournaments. And even if we do take a running back, or maybe the only running back in the dead zone, then again, that type of back is the profile who has that can win tournaments for us. So we break down these first couple of rounds. As you mentioned, Taylor, McCaffrey. I think the 1 and 2 is a running back start. I think that the middle of that round, those receivers that I think could end up being the 1 and 2 in next year's draft, very clear zero RB from the middle. And then at the end, it gets tricky. I like Devontae Adams, and I've come around on CeeDee Lamb. I think coming around on CeeDee Lamb and also being much more focused on getting tight ends in some of the formats that I've been playing recently has been one of the reasons for that shift to a more zero RB approach. You look at the numbers for Aaron Rodgers versus Derek Carr over the last 2 years, and you see that Derek Carr actually looks better in almost every category except for touchdown right now. The touchdowns are hugely important, and it's not something like they're barely different, right? I mean, you have Aaron Rodgers as the superstar, you have Derek Carr as a quarterback who is vastly underperformed in terms of throwing touchdowns. And so that part I think you have to worry about for Davante Adams. He's going to bring some of those touchdowns with him, you would expect, and perhaps the new scheme as well will help. Well, we don't know that he'll bring all of them. We have some question marks there. I think that Davante Adams' profile, and I've also warmed up to this for Tyreek Hill a little bit, especially as he's been very good in Dolphins camp. I think that part of it, for me, is where news is helpful. The Dolphins traded for Tyreek Hill. We know that they have a lot of incentive to talk him up, but the reports from writers and observers have also been very good there. One of the reasons why I think Tyreek Hill could end up being undervalued is he had kind of a flukily bad season last year. And even if the quarterback and offensive situation is a downgrade, just a little bit of random bounce back probably mitigates the fall that he might have for the rest of this context. So you could even take him early. But when you're looking at Davante Adams and then you're looking at CeeDee Lamb, you and I are not hyper-focused on volume, but for me, and again, this is really a contingency-based play, not so much a volume-based play, but it seemed like they almost went out of their way at times to emphasize other players and to use the stardom that we think Lamb possesses to make Dalton Schultz and Amari Cooper look good. Obviously, Cooper is gone. They've had some other receiver injuries. I am a little bit concerned, and it's one of the reasons why I'm really not on Dak Prescott, even though I do like Lamb. It sounds like their offensive line and their left tackle situation could be bad. I don't put an overemphasis on that, but you maybe want to be at least aware of the fact that there could be some issues there. But if CeeDee Lamb kind of falls into one of these situations where, he has a 30, 31, 32% target share in what ends up being a high volume passing offense, I think that he could justify this draft slot that early in the offseason I thought was fairly aspirational, really. So I'm more comfortable now with the Adams Lamb start. I'm comfortable with Adams Pitts. This is heartbreaking to say because Stephon Diggs, I think, has really always been one of the headliners or the poster boy for so much of what we were doing at RotoViz, and we saw him as the second coming of Antonio Brown. There are a variety of things there that I think make him a trickier first-round pick or a reach. And so you get into that like 7, 8, 9 range. Maybe that's early for Davante Adams, even though I did select him there last night. Saquon Barkley, probably the biggest risk of any running back in the first 2 rounds. But if any running back in the first 2 rounds is going to compete with Jonathan Taylor and Christian McCaffrey, it almost has to be him.
Yep. And so he goes in that range justifiably. To break down that second tier of receivers, I'm right with you on Lamb. We've talked all offseason about his targets per out run profile looking just so similar to Cooper Kupp in the sense that he has drawn enough that you feel like there's meat left on that bone. And obviously the trade of Amari Cooper, reduces the competition that he's running routes against or with, right? Should bump his targets per out run probably just as a default expectation a little bit. But really, we need to see him really, take that next step. He didn't necessarily take in year 2, but there's room there. There's meat on that bone, and ton of room for him to add routes because he's never actually been a full route share guy quite yet. And he's been efficient after the target in terms of yards per target and those elements so far in a way that looks like that's going to be something he's going to carry throughout his career. He's just really good. That doesn't necessarily mean he's going to be Cooper Kupp because Cooper Kupp gained in all those areas to astronomical levels. But the target stuff for Lamb, like you said, he could be a 31, 32% target share guy. And if that could really gain. both the routes and the targets per out run could gain in a way that really just makes the overall targets balloon. And if he's efficient per target, again, it doesn't mean he's going to hit Cooper Kupp levels, but it would be that type of ascension from a profile perspective, from the ways that I would look at things. And so I have moved him just recently this week to my wide receiver 4. I still have Diggs 5, and the Diggs Adams stuff is really interesting. You are increasingly excited about Adams, it feels like to me, or maybe you have been all throughout, but the more we talk, the more you're making these arguments. And I guess you typically can convince me of things, but I just am not there with Adams. I think he's an incredible receiver. I think he's incredibly good at route running. Earlier in his career, before these last couple years, Adams, like one of the things with Adams, he always had the touchdowns, but his like yards per target type after the target efficiency was never good. Like never even good. It was okay for most of his career. His career high was 8.2 yards per target through 2019 across his first 6 seasons. A lot of years in this, the first couple years were really poor, but a lot of years in the 7.5 to 8.2 range, 7.6 one year, 7.9 one year. Really elevated that the last 2 years. And in part, that's just a catch rate thing where he had previously never caught more than 65.7% of balls. The last 2 years, he's been over 70%, well over it. 72.8% last year, 77% of his targets he caught in 2020. I think a lot of that has to do with the pre-snap stuff with Aaron Rodgers, the reads that they developed over so many years, throwing to him quick, very catchable balls, throwing these back shoulders that they were so on point with. That's what helped elevate his yards per target. His yards per reception basically looked the same as it had prior. Not that amazing, not that efficient. Very, very good at earning volume, but not that efficient in terms of like yak or what have you, whatever it is. Going to a new offense, going to a new quarterback, even though there is familiarity there, they played together in college. That was, 8 years ago. He's played in the NFL for 8 years. I mean, it was nine years ago. His rookie year was 2014. So talk about 2013 range. Even though he has played with Carr before, I just don't think the elements of what him and Rodgers developed that led to these 70+% catch rates that then helped him get the yards per target. Which again, if you're catching a higher percentage of targets, that really helps the yards per target, sort of the difference between yards per target and yards per out run. Or excuse me, yards per reception. Yards per target and yards per reception. Yeah, I guess I don't see in a new offense him being so efficient on the yards per target side, on the after earning the target side. I'm concerned about the touchdowns as well, which have always been a massive part of his profile. Double-digit touchdowns in 5 of the last 6 years. Hunter Renfrow, really good in the red zone last year. Darren Waller was really good. Got a ton of red zone looks 2 years ago in 2020. They've talked about getting Waller more involved down there. The Renfrow stuff, I think, has to carry over to some degree, and I'm not in on Renfrow, but a lot of that is that short area quickness, these triple moves he was running. I think those are things that Carr is going to look for still. And so much of Adams' high touchdown stuff was that he was basically Rodgers' only show in town sometimes. The guy he trusted to be right in the right spot, and Rodgers is so precise with the ball. I think Adams is very, very good, but all of that context, unless there's a Renfrow or Waller injury, I think those are elements that can really play into it. And Waller's been banged up. A lot of people saying probably contract related, finally got a nice little boost to his salary. I'm kind of buying that. I think Waller's going to be just fine. If one of Renfrow or Waller is gone, I think Adams could really start to consolidate those red zone looks and all of those things. But I guess I'm not as in on the Raiders offense overall as you are. I think they're going to score a lot and be fine, but I don't think they're going to be good enough to support, 3 good red zone weapons in a way that Adams is a lock for double-digit TDs. Maybe he's a 10 or 11 TD guy, but, he had 18 a couple of years ago in his monster season. I just don't see it with him. On the flip side, Diggs, who you're kind of out on, I still have over Adams, even though I moved him behind Lamb. And again, it goes back to this yards per target, yards per reception thing. Part of why I was emphasizing that so much with Adams is it really is a big part of Diggs' profile, where Diggs' profile looked the exact same last year as it did in his big 2020, other than he caught 76.5% of passes in 2020, he caught 62.8% in 2021. So his yards per target cratered from 9.2 to 7.5. His yards per reception, 12.1, 11.9, same number, right? So it's just, could he have caught a few more of those balls, or will he now this year? I love Gabe Davis. Think he's going to be awesome. Love this offense overall. Big enough pie, in my opinion, for both. I think Davis can be really good without needing to be a massive target share guy, because his profile is exactly what you want. It's the vertical and it's the end zone shots. That's what he's always had in the limited roles. We saw him catch another touchdown in the preseason this year. Obviously, the 4 TDs in last playoffs. But Diggs is the guy that I still would pretty comfortably predict to lead the team in targets. He has over 160 the last 2 years. Very pass-heavy team. If that catch rate for him is just in between the last 2 years, and it was way down last year, he's actually probably, in my mind, going to be better from like a yards per target type efficiency than Adams, in all likelihood, even at a similar catch rate, because he seems to do more, a little bit of a higher ADOT. Anyway, it's an interesting discussion, but the way I look at it and all the conversations we've had about it, I don't see the concern you do for Diggs, even as I'm very in on Davis. I think they both can be top 10 receivers in this offense. And I also don't see as much reason for optimism with Adams as you do.
Yeah, I think the contrast there is that the 2021 season was very positive for Adams in terms of continuing to develop and add and maintain in terms of things like yards after the catch, where this is an element that Diggs cratered in last season, perhaps a little bit of a red flag. You talk about that catch rate dropping, and one of the reasons the catch rate dropped is that he lost some of those underneath targets that are so important and were such a big part of him having the breakout. One of the things that we loved about him going to Buffalo there was that they used him as this all-around receiver. He'd had those 2 really bizarre years back-to-back in Minnesota, where he was the ultimate possession target one year and the ultimate vertical target the next, but not both. And then the Bills use him as that. It's one of these elements where an increasing ADOT is not necessarily good if you're losing some of those targets that have a high catch rate that transfer instantly into fantasy points, because you get that point per reception in so many leagues, and then you have a chance to run afterward. You watch him play last season, and he was Diggs, right? I mean, he is unbelievable in terms of his ability to get open. He has that Antonio Brown flair to him, and yet it was a little bit like DJ Moore in the second half of the season, where you're not really sure if it's the quarterback play or an injury, but Moore didn't look as explosive, as dynamic. He didn't have that same rugged explosiveness after the catch that he had had previously. Diggs didn't have that same underneath explosiveness, and Josh Allen wasn't particularly accurate on a lot of those underneath passes. And so these plays that had been automatic first downs with some yak opportunity in 2020, those dried up just enough in 2021 that we saw him fall back down to a very playable level, but a level where if you drafted him in the first round last year, you were disappointed. And if you're drafting him in the first round this year, you need him to bounce back in a more positive way, especially with Davis being on the ascent. I'm not necessarily predicting this because, again, I'm a massive Stephon Diggs fan in a vacuum, but I do think that we have potential for this to be the year that's similar to Chris Godwin in 2019, where you have a prospect who came into the NFL very young, was underdrafted by the NFL, but then doesn't have, that top 15 draft capital to where the team that drafted him is pushing him out there to be a star instantly. You have a good first season, you have a tantalizing second season, but then in year 3, Godwin blows by Chris Evans, becomes the wide receiver 2 in all of football. Unfortunately, they've changed some things with Tom Brady. He hasn't stayed that healthy, but we've continued to watch as Chris Godwin has been very good since then. And I mean, you especially, I think, are very excited about the potential to draft him a little bit of a discount if he's going to be good in the second half of the season, or if he's going to be, himself. Chris Godwin is a superstar. It's always easy to talk about those things after the fact. And we shouldn't buy Davis with the idea that he's going to be their number 1 or that he's going to be the wide receiver 2 in all of football. But the reason that he's going so high, beyond just the week 17 and for, full playoff tournaments, week 15 through 17, potential within the context of that offense in the week 17 game against the Bengals. There are a variety of things pushing up Davis, and he is one of these guys where over the course of the offseason, he just goes higher and higher and higher, because if you want to get some exposure, you keep having to pay more. And everyone now has to kind of fight to jump in front of the next drafter to get him. So there's a little bit of strictly that dynamic, but there also is some pricing in of this potential for him to actually be the megastar.
So
he has that, size, athleticism, production profile.
And I'm right there with you. I ranked him incredibly high even before this rise, and have been writing over at the newsletter that I think he has the potential to be that, third or fourth round receiver that's a top 10 player. I love it. I mean, I have a lot of Gabriel Davis this year. What I had said when I was talking about Diggs is I think they can both be top 10 receivers. You're talking about a scenario where, with the Godwin example, where Davis is like a top 3 guy, and that actually does really impact Diggs. I'm seeing it as Davis can be like wide receiver 8 while Diggs is still wide receiver 2. And they're both, and again, this is a part of this is, look, Dawson Knox not good at earning volume on targets per out run basis. The James Cook stuff, they wanted to add a running back in the passing game. That was the talk of all offseason. They went after J.D. McKissick, all of these things. They have not thrown to the running backs a ton for a reason. I've talked about this before, but like the teams like the Saints, you want to make the Alvin Kamara comparison. They did that with every back because Drew Brees did that the way he went through his reads and dropped it off. It's a lot. For me, running back receiving is a lot tied to the quarterback. That's something Josh Allen has to develop. And you talked about how Allen couldn't even necessarily throw the short passes to Stephon Diggs. He's not going to be Drew Brees suddenly. I don't think the running back receiving is going to develop in this offense the way that many others do, or reading into their offseason moves. As I think they want it to, but I just don't think it's going to be as easy as that will seem. They might be average at running back receiving. I don't think they're going to be above average. And there's still outcomes where they're below average in terms of running back receiving, in my opinion. And again, not a lot of tight end production. And I really haven't even necessarily been buying into the Isaiah McKenzie hype, because the way I see this operating is Gabriel Davis breaks out in a way that then makes Stephon Diggs not get the double teams and everything that I thought he was getting a lot last year. I agree with you. He didn't necessarily look as good last year. But I think Gabriel Davis exploding helps Diggs so much, and that Diggs becomes so much better because of it.
I think it could help him. I don't think that Davis is going to hurt him. I'm just not that focused on how the volume plays out for most of the star receivers, because I think that they dictate the number of passes they get big picture. Now, we know there are some exceptions. We're not saying that there's absolutely no element of that to it. I guess with Diggs, though, to borrow kind of the term that Pat has used in talking about running backs, is sort of a legendary upside element for me, to where I think that Diggs is probably a small win, small loss type of first round draft pick.
Fair.
And it's almost a situation where the same thing at wide receiver that I want for my running backs, if I'm going to use a first round pick, is I want there to be the chance that not only does that guy not lose it for me, but that he is actually the person that drives the team to victory. I don't know that I see that for Diggs, even though I agree with you. I don't think that the peripheral targets are going to play a big role.
You don't see it as being Chase Higgins. Like, I think it's Chase Higgins.
That would be fantastic. That would be fantastic. I mean, I'm still drafting some Diggs. I drafted Diggs at the 106 a couple of days ago when Chase went at the 105. Picked Diggs over Austin Eckler. So I'm definitely still there. But when we talk about where you might take this detour from 0RB, and you think about how things have shifted from 2013 to now, one of the things that you can occasionally get caught with is just not actually having the wide receiver with that epic upside at the back end of the first round that we've always focused on, because you don't want to chase those running back points. But every year you're talking about specific players, not purely about structure. And so when people push back against structure, I can understand that too, right? Because you're going to have players if you want to execute your plan. You can't just draft whoever the next guy is in ADP and think that that's going to make it work for you. Sometimes ADP is wrong. I know that's not something that we necessarily say in 2022, but it is wrong, right? Or it doesn't give you what you need. That's probably a better way to say it, right? It doesn't give you what you need. And so you're willing to take that risk for a Saquon Barkley or a DeAndre Swift or in tight end premium, very specifically for Kyle Pitts or Mark Andrews to make that part of it work. Within tight end premium, I think when you have those tight ends there, you have enough options that you don't necessarily need to select a running back. In regular formats, you may just actually need to select a running back there. Select your Saquon Barkley. But then the next thing is we get into round 3, and it's your guy or your 2 guys, Ben, that have made round 3 a lot more interesting to me as a 0 RB drafter, and made it easier to go 0 RB when you have that pick in the middle, when you have a Jefferson, Cup, Chase type of build, because every day I get more excited about AJ Brown. Every day I become willing to take DJ Moore. Ben, I mentioned you several times in relation to the podcast, but specifically separate from that in the AJ Brown blurb for today's best pick in every round. He was the best pick in the 3rd round. AJ Brown, now with this potential to jump in routes that you've talked about, and DJ Moore with Baker Mayfield, we can be back on those 2 guys. And then as the offseason has progressed as well, come around to this idea more and more that Mike Williams is the way to play the Chargers, and that his injury last season is the only thing keeping him there, as opposed to being in the middle of the 2nd round with Hill and Deebo Samuel. With those 3 guys, it's not just one option, right? I mean, when you're planning out your draft, if you just have one guy, then you have so many situations where you're disappointed, and then you make mistakes because you're not prepared. Now that I have those 3 players, I feel like I have a path through that round.
Yeah, that's a fantastic range I want to get to. We obviously can't spend the whole conversation on the 2nd-tier receivers, but that was a great conversation. And part of why I was pushing back so much is I do think it's sort of a tacit thing. I really want to understand your perspective on Adams, and so I appreciate you saying all that. But like I said, it might be more of a tacit thing, more of a feel thing, and I get that. The other point I really want to make on that before I jump into those round 3 receivers is you said ADP, not necessarily wrong, might not give you what you want. I think I can speak for you to just add a little color to that. And what you're saying is we want league winners. We want elite ceilings. And one of the things that I've written about last year at the newsletter, when I talked about some types of fantasy analysis that are overused, which was sort of my nice way of saying shouldn't be used, is this idea that of beating ADP, of end of season finish vis-a-vis where the player went, and that means that he was a good pick. We get that a lot with like sort of dead zone running backs who play 17 games and they finish as RB12. And then people say, well, he was RB25. He finished RB12. That pick hurt your team. I mean, and it's really hard to grasp that, I think, for a lot of people, especially because the industry has spent so much time talking in that manner, talking about beating ADP. So what you're saying is that actually doesn't help you as much as it feels like it might when you just look at, oh, he was the RB12 when you got drafted as the RB25. What helps you is league winners, right? And upside. And also just upside, even if it's in spurts. And that's one of the things we're looking at with rookie receivers, young players, like what Amon-Ra St. Brown did at the end of last year was more impactful for fantasy last year than what Josh Jacobs did, who was the perfect example of he was the RB12 last year and probably went right at RB25. I think I've just described Josh Jacobs. He was good all year. He had 2 20-point games. Basically, all you were buying into there was the knowledge of who your RB2 was, but he wasn't winning you weeks. He was just keeping you, I guess, from losing them. But losing them or having a low score any given week, it's a weekly game. It doesn't hurt you as much as those ceiling outcomes help you. And that is, I mean, something we talk about a ton. So anyway, to just expand on that point you were making about ADP not really getting you what you want, there's just so much discussion of, well, this guy's obviously going to finish higher than where he's being drafted. That's not the whole point. The point is these breakout profiles, like you were talking about with Barkley and other guys that can be the season definers. The 3rd round, AJ Brown, DJ Moore, I don't really think I have to talk about. I think I've talked about them enough, and you hit on them very well. Moore, the one that crystallized it for me was, even though his yards per target were really poor last year, everyone's in that passing game were awful, were way worse than even his. He didn't play particularly well. I don't really knock him for it because that team was terrible. They were so bad. It's so funny. I wrote an article last year about situation regression and how things couldn't get worse for DJ Moore. They were not necessarily couldn't get worse, but basically trying to quantify what his situation and the factors outside of his own play what it was in 2020 and how that negatively impacted him, and called it probably like a 10th percentile outcome for him, and said like there's a lot more room for it to get better. I think it was probably a 5th percentile outcome for him last year. So it did manage to get worse. I do still think there's a lot of room for Baker to not necessarily be good, but just be a lot better than what they did last year. Their team passing numbers just atrocious. And then Mike Williams, what you said is totally correct. I think that third round is, and I would even throw in Cortland Sutton. I know you're liking to play the Broncos more through Jerry Jeudy, but I'm still pretty excited about Sutton. Another one where it's like, I think you can see it both ways. And I can totally understand being firmly in on Jeudy. For me, it's been probably, to be completely honest, more of a film take that I feel like when Sutton's been at his best has been a player that I can see being an incredibly good elite overall, not overall, but, wide receiver 1 type player, very talented down the field. I don't know that I've seen anything from Jeudy that has me believing that, other than the fact that he does draw targets at a really high rate. I know you made the comparison to Kupp, and it is very similar to what I described with Lamb. The big difference for me with Jeudy is he hasn't necessarily been particularly effective after the target with the yards per target type efficiency. Bad quarterbacks, huge improvement in quarterback. Russell Wilson's receivers have always been efficient after the target, in part because he holds the ball so long, takes sacks, doesn't really release the ball unless it's a great throwing opportunity. So we should expect Jeudy's numbers in that type of area to rise. But especially when you control for his ADOT, you've talked about how his air yards are a little higher. He hasn't been, ADOT adjusted, super efficient like Lamb. That's a slight difference for me on those guys. But I'm with you. I'm coming around on Jeudy because of the Russell Wilson and all that stuff. I do still think Sutton is maybe better, and so I have Sutton in this range with these guys. But yeah, the round 3 range is great. The round 4 range, we talked about Waddle, Gabe Davis, Deontay Johnson, who we've talked a lot about. You've written about recently. Couldn't agree with you more on him. You talked about Pittman. You're coming around on Michael Pittman? Is that what you're saying?
Well, he's going at the wide receiver 9, right? That's the 301. We saw him in one of our drafts go at 311 the other day. I think when he gets into that range, then you can definitely consider it. He, for me, is a guy where you don't want to buy all of the projection. If you pay for it, then you don't get the value out of it. Now you're saying he needs to take that leap into, almost the Devontae Adams type of range. You look at Cortland Sutton, he's someone that, despite more target competition, I think has demonstrated the types of things that we want to see from Michael Pittman. The other thing for Pittman is he actually has sort of more sneaky target competition this year, definitely than he had last year. And so, that's a perspective and a context that doesn't seem to be taken into account. I wrote about Pittman and Waddle. And the thing with Waddle is that obviously you have this injury concern. And I definitely don't blame any listener or drafter who's shying away from these guys who are hurt a little bit. That's perfectly fine. You do want to get off to a fast start if you can. Taking a healthy player in the exact same range as an injured player, if you have them fairly close, makes a lot of sense. The profiles in that article, I think, are just very convincing in terms of Waddle having a much higher ceiling, and he's a lot cheaper. And so that doesn't mean that's how it'll play out. That is helpful if you play with the range of outcomes tool, is that you can work through it and you can see very easily how if Michael Pittman hits a 75th percentile outcome and Jalen Waddle hits a 25th percentile outcome, then Pittman wins. And then all the Pittman drafters are right. And they may have reasons outside of the things that I have discussed that make him a great pick for them. I always want drafters and listeners to take the players who fit what they want to do. And so that part of it I like and I am a fan of. The thing about Jeudy is that he looks like a very easy way to play the 5th round. He is at the 506. He is never there in any draft that I am in. And so at some point, even if you've done a very large number, you have to take him kind of around your rankings if you want to get him. It's easy to say I can play Jeudy as a discount element or just a cheaper way to get exposure to that passing game if I have them close, or even if I have Sutton above. And that's the thing that you and I have done a lot with Elijah Moore, a player we absolutely love. Talked about him again today. Crazy numbers. If Elijah Moore were a couple inches taller, had gone in the 1st round, didn't get injured at the end of last season, had a better quarterback, he'd be like a second round pick. But those are 4 different things, all of which you'd like to be different. The main thing that actually matters is still the quarterback play. When you look at Elijah Moore and you're thinking, well, what if the offense is a train wreck? Because that's something that just is so infuriating, right? I mean, having to run DJ Moore out there, making the decision to run Terry McLaurin out there instead of Amon-Ra in week, I think it was 14 last season, cost us a lot of money in the main event. You don't really want to be in that position with a guy that you drafted in the 3rd or 4th round to be taking a 20th round rookie instead. You have to make the switch, and we obviously did after we lost those key points. You've got to be willing to adjust to the new thing that happens, but you don't want to be drafting players in these high leverage rounds where you can see a really easy scenario where they're just not startable at all. And so with Elijah Moore, you're thinking, well, how can I take that risk and minimize it? Well, I do it by simply drafting Garrett Wilson. That's why our exposure to him is so high. I mean, this is a guy drafted at the top of the draft, has great athleticism, was productive in college. So it's not like you're taking some massive compromise pick. And, you want some exposure to the rookies, and you don't want it all to be George Pickens. You don't want it all to be Sky Moore. Those guys, I think, have elite breakout potential. If you pick exclusively one guy, then you run into that chance that you hit Jalen Reagor instead of Justin Jefferson, and then you spend the whole season thinking, well, what might have been, right? So that's kind of how we're
just thinking. Packer A's just catching strays here. Our buddy Packer A took a lot of Reagor instead of Jefferson that year.
Well, Jalen Reagor is now moved over to the Minnesota Vikings, going to be the number 2 right there, right?
Yeah, that's the way to go. No, you said a lot of things. It was funny you mentioned Judy. I drafted 101 in a home league on Sunday night. I was excited to get Judy at the 4-5 turn. Figured it was a no-brainer in a home league. He went 404 even in a home league. So yeah, I mean, every draft I'm in, I'm feeling the same way, where you do got to pay a little for Judy. Anyway, you had kind of moved on from that point. Did you have more to add?
Well, for me, the part where zero RB gets tricky again is in the middle of the 5th. And I'm looking at this ADP and I'm seeing Rashad Bateman at the 601. Formats are going to be a little bit different. We see some formats that are less favorable for wide receivers in some ways. And again, half PPR can actually be beneficial for the early wide receivers because they're the ones who can actually compete with these early running backs. So we want to always make that distinction too. But Rashad Bateman's someone who doesn't get past the early 5th. Again, any drafts that I have been in, I've been in a lot in the last week. If Judy and Bateman are gone, then we get back into this back 3rd. And again, I think it's drafters who have the 9th pick, the 10th pick, the 11th pick, the last pick, where you have to really be prepared because you could get hit with some scenarios where you're going to have to take an emergency player. You want it to be an emergency player that you were set with, that you're excited about, not that you get done after you're drafted. Like I wasn't ready for the 5-6 turn. Once those guys are gone, are we feeling confident with DK Metcalf? Are we feeling comfortable with Darnell Mooney? Mooney looks like somebody, if you want to make a volume play on a guy who's actually pretty good. I mean, Darnell Mooney he and Cole Kmet are going to take all of the targets.
Yeah, Mooney's a lot easier to play than Michael Pittman, and very similar to me in what you said. They would probably need to take another step forward to be really good in terms of things like targets per out run and their overall production. And people are projecting that and not really accounting for the fact that last year, neither of them really had much competition at all. Mooney didn't. I mean, he's running routes with Allen Robinson, who seemed to be trying not to run routes, like more than any receiver in the NFL. And yet Mooney got, you mentioned that Pittman has some sneaky target competition. I think Mooney got kind of lucky, if you will, in that like there's nothing else there. You mentioned Cole Kmet, but there's nothing else. And you have to feel like Mooney can at least repeat last year, talk about a volume play, right? Or even gain a little bit. I think he's like an easier play than Michael Pittman. I mean, without considering cost, maybe, but certainly when you throw in cost. But yeah, I'm right there with you on him. I moved him up. I had him as a fade originally and got a little pushback on him and didn't really have a good reason why to not have him included in a higher tier and moved him up in my rankings a little bit. Metcalf's a guy that I think makes a lot of sense. I want to circle back again to something else you said about the Terry McLaurin pick we made last year. Longtime listeners will remember we were picking from the back third like we did in all of our drafts last year. McLaurin was a 2-3 turn guy in almost every draft. We ended up taking him at like 311 because he fell all the way through. Neither of us really wanted him or was in on McLaurin, but it was an opportunity to get sort of unique and to get a player that didn't typically fall that far. It's kind of what you just described with Michael Pittman, who's got the 301 ADP, and you've seen him go as late as 311. We took McLaurin in that spot thinking, okay, if we're wrong on this is going to be a really nice price to have a share of McLaurin. One of the ways it didn't work out for us is even though he was fine, but we were pretty much right about him that he wasn't really worth that pick, is that you describe how that hurts you in the season because you took him in the third round. Even by the end of the year, we were starting him over that 20th round upstart that we had added, Amon-Ra St. Brown, because it just didn't feel like we could not go to bat with our third round pick in the big shootout, and it ended up being very costly. So it's not just that you end up taking a player you don't like in draft day. It's also that it can impact you all throughout the year because you feel like you have to defend that by playing this player. Very interesting additional note to the stuff we talk about all the time about drafting fun teams and drafting players you actually want to pick. In hindsight, obviously, we wish we didn't have Terry McLaurin on that roster. If we would have taken literally anyone else, somebody who got hurt, we would have started Amon-Ra St. Brown at that point and been better off for it. But yeah, that 5-6 turn that you're referencing, I'm very comfortable with Metcalf at that point. But for me, it becomes a discussion of, at this point, Drake London, Devonta Smith, and Brandon Ayuk are still too cheap. Their ADPs are pretty far behind that. And I'm very comfortable just moving them up as well. Everyone else has moved up. Everyone else that we liked at the 4-5 turn has become 3-4 turn guys. Everyone we liked at 5-6 is now gone by the 5th. You just talked about Judy having a 5th round ADP, and he never makes it to the 4-5. He goes in the 4th round. Or sometimes he makes it to the 4-5, but you're not going to get him at 5-06. I'm very comfortable taking that next group of receivers from maybe the 6-7 turn up into the 5th-6th turn. Is that how you would play it if you didn't have, say, Metcalf, maybe throw Mooney in, Mooney's gone, say they're gone. I just want to get London and Devonta Smith and Brandon Ayuk at that point.
Yeah, so we're talking about Brandon Ayuk in the late 7th, Drake London and Devonta Smith in the early 8th. The other thing that has become easier for me as the offseason has gone along is just to go ahead and reach on these receivers if I feel like they're the player who, even at the price I'm paying, which may be a little bit above market, they can still beat by 3 or 4 rounds. That's the element that we always must have when we're picking in that range. It's not that we're going to hit every time, but if we have, say, 7 options to get 5 or 6 top 15 wide receivers, some of those players can miss, some of them can get hurt, and we're still going to have that super team at the end. The other thing that we can start to look to do here in a 0 RB build, we potentially have the early tight end, and then we can get a Lamar Jackson, a Jalen Hurts, a Kyler Murray, a Trey Lance, and have that hybrid QB just league winning and tournament breaking upside at the quarterback position and have it work within the build to where we're not necessarily behind, because right after that, we're going to get some of these priority 0 RB candidates. Is that something that you're looking to do? Obviously, if you miss a QB, you still have plenty of options late, so you don't have to press it. But if we hit a flat area, if we decide we don't want an Elijah Moore because we're looking at Garrett Wilson, or we don't want an Elijah Moore because we don't want to have exposure to the Jets, or he's gone because sometimes he is gone. I love the fact that this year it sets up so perfectly to have that receiver upside and to get the QB upside without reaching for players who are maybe a little bit more, I don't say limited, but just a little bit different fantasy profiles in terms of like Patrick Mahomes and Justin Herbert.
Yeah, and I guess I'm comfortable with that. We're sitting here talking about the 5-6 turns so much, but it is tough because it's tough to play for someone to fall back to the 7-8 turn at QB, because you don't always get that in these drafts. It's also tough to play the way I was describing London, Ayuk, Smith, and I was very almost shocked to hear you say what their ADPs are on that tool that you're looking at, where they're late 7 or early 8. So I feel like they don't come back to the 7-8 turn. I mean, I feel like they go at the 6-7 in a lot of drafts I'm in. Having said that, we did have our draft that we recently did on stream where we got some things to fall to us in the 10 slot. We got Ayuk and Devonta Smith at the 7-8 turn after starting with the 4 running backs in the first 6 rounds. We got Lance to fall all the way to 9-10 and Sky Moore at 10-03, which, again, I emphasized on the show, I had not seen, and I have not seen since, anything close to that with Sky Moore or with Lance even. There's a little bit of a discussion there about, do you play for the best possible outcome in your draft? If you're talking about these main events, if you're talking about big tournaments, you have to have that in the back of your mind. And so if you're at the 5-6 and you're taking guys that might be there at the 7-8, you're maybe hamstringing your own roster in terms of what it could be on draft day. Obviously, we are of the mind that the team you draft is not the only thing that matters, because there's a lot of stuff that happens the rest of the way. But I've definitely warmed to this idea of trying to get as much value out of every draft as possible. And it's a riskier move because it can leave you in a position where you don't get your goals accomplished in the draft. You don't get the receiver depth you wanted to, and you feel like this team is going to struggle all season as a result. So that's tricky. I mean, that idea at the 5-6 that most of those targets are guys that in certain rooms could come all the way back to the 7-8. The way we played it on that stream was to take Breece Hall and J.K. Dobbins. Dobbins now I saw go in the 7th round last night. People are very concerned about the rehab. I feel like that's a little bit of double counting. We knew what the injury was. He was already priced down because of that injury. He is limping around a little bit. Yes, like that's not ideal that he's not really fully ready to go at this stage. And at the same time, he keeps saying he's fine. And, obviously he's going to say that, but I do think we're doing a little bit of double counting, like I said, where we knew what this rehab was. We knew, but we also know that if he's able to be healthy, that there's upside scenarios there. And so when you start talking about him into the 6-7 turn, like Dobbins is, anyway, that's neither here nor there. But
well, if he says he's okay, then I say limp a little bit more, play up that injury.
Yeah,
get us some good prices.
Get some 7th round J.K. Dobbins. Okay. Because, when he was going in the 5th round, that was already a discount from the 3rd round because he was rehabbing. I think if he's fully healthy, he's a 3rd round pick. So what are we're just seeing visuals of a rehab that we knew was tricky already, but we were picking him again for these upside scenarios, not necessarily because we think he's definitely healthy. Anyway. So that 5-6 turn you identified is really tricky though. And I guess, like I said, I just prefer to lock in some receivers that I really like and keep pushing them up. I think all of the receivers are starting to come up. I think in these last 10 days before the draft, 8 days, whatever, 7 days before the season starts, we're closer than I'm even doing the math in my head quick enough to account for. I think we're going to just continue to see these prices on these receivers get trickier. Especially with the Dobbins slide, with Breece Hall has started to slide, right? With a lot of the dead zone backs having concerns, right? Like the Antonio Gibson fall had already happened, but Elijah Mitchell falling. And our one saving grace is Dameon Pierce is now going so high that's pushing a couple of receivers down, but there's not a lot of running backs that were in that dead zone that have continued to stick in that range. They're falling. Receivers are rising as a result. QBs are falling. Lance is falling. I guess I want to get your thoughts on Lance too, but anyway, that's my thought is, even if those guys are showing 7th, 8th round ADPs, I'm not expecting them to come back to the 7-8. And I think I just want to make sure I get my receivers at 5-6.
And one of the things that we can do when we reach but have multiple targets is then you still do have some potential to get the player when you come back around the next time, even though obviously a lot of picks transpire in between, you could still get the value on the person that you don't select. It doesn't completely eliminate you from having some of that upside. Ben, the part that you talk about there in terms of the running backs falling, I think this is the other key discussion point for zero RB in 2022. And probably we shouldn't left it to the 1 hour mark, but we do like to have some good content late for the listeners who like to stick all the way through to the end of the show. And that's that while your ability to build a zero RB super team with these crazy wide receiver weapons that just absolutely annihilate your league, while that has decreased in 2022 because of the wide receivers going earlier and because of some of the profiles in the third round, especially and the second round. I mean, we're talking about, small win players even in round one. So those first 3 rounds maybe being a little bit weaker. The flip side of it is that the penalty that you suffer for going zero RB is much different now than it was 5 years ago, much different now than it was 10 years ago, where you literally were just trying to figure out how you could cobble together some running back points over the first month to 6 weeks of the season. And I think back to some of those, 2012, 2013 high stakes teams where especially, and you have to play all these things for your specific format, but maybe your record is not that good, but in weeks 10, 11, 12, 13, your team is just shelling the league to the point where you make up 150 point stagger over the last month. Because at that point, you've got your running backs figured out and your wide receivers just continue to hammer everybody and did so through the bye weeks. In 2022, you're not looking for points at all, right? In round 8, we have Rashad Penny and Devin Singletary. In round 9, you have the Patriots starter. You have Darrell Henderson, who may be in a pure committee with Cam Akers. You have this third running back drafted in James Cook. You have Melvin Gordon, who, Ben, I know people are concerned about Gordon's age, and I also share that concern in the same way I share that concern for the 27-year-olds in the round 1 and 2 area. But his peripherals the last couple of years still fantastic.
Yeah,
and if you're going to be chasing, if you're chasing older running backs, chase the ones that are really good.
Right.
I mean, Melvin Gordon is a former superstar.
Yeah. And cheap, and I'm super in on Javonte, but I'm totally fine with taking Melvin Gordon there. But there's more. There's even more running backs. Continue.
Yeah, I mean, round 10, we have Kenneth Gainwell. We have Michael Carter. We have Rashad White. If you want Isaiah Pacheco, I would let Pacheco fall a little bit, but you can sometimes get him in the 12th now because not every round. He's one of those backs who can go all over the place. You can get him as a discount. We have Raheem Mostert, who may be the starter or, the kind of starter for the Dolphins in round 12. There's no penalty, right? And this is the other thing that we sort of alluded to in the intro that has become clearer is sort of, which players here you feel the most comfortable taking, but it's also that there are so many. I love this range of drafts.
There really are. And when you say there's no penalty, there's a slight penalty to the absolute elite running back seasons, but essentially beyond what, Taylor and Eckler were last year, those backs we're talking about there, getting multiple of them, playing them, treating your RB2 and potentially also RB1 slot as a, not an individual player, but a slot in your offense for your fantasy team, and playing these backs as the roles materialize and shooting for some of the high upside games when your handcuffs get starts. I've talked a lot about, maybe more in writing lately, about Alexander Madison as a guy who didn't do a lot in most weeks, but had 3 20-point games in the weeks where he was starting. He's a really great example of that last year, where in a managed league, you're getting those 20-point games. Everybody was playing him in DFS. It's not hard to really predict that this is a good week to play with Alexander Madison. Whereas if you're trying to do the late round receiver thing, receiver scoring is very volatile, and it's very tough to get that right in your starting lineup. That's what gets missed when people talk about end of season receiver scoring being, flat or something. It's a lot easier to get an Alexander Madison in your lineup when he's scoring the 20-point games and then sit him when he's not, when he's having the duds, than it is for a late round running back. D'Ernest Johnson is another guy I wrote about recently, but there's so many examples of this. You're also looking in that range that you just described, Sean, for the James Conner of this year, the Leonard Fournette of this year, that are basically startable every single week, and they're just as good as dead zone backs or even some of the other first 3 round backs. But the point I was making is you can build out a running back, your RB2 slot that has some weekly ceiling from those spot starts that you get and otherwise has strong floor. And you've almost matched at least almost every single other running back other than the very elite ones. And so, yes, there is maybe a little trade-off when there are guys who have the legendary seasons that we talk about, but there aren't a ton of those and they're not easy to find. And so that's the whole sort of idea with zero RB, is that trying to land the legendary running back, you can take those swings in some anchor RB builds or modified zero RB builds. But otherwise, you're just admitting that you're not necessarily going to have them. They again, go back to my dead zone, original dead zone research in 2019, and has continued to maintain those elite running back ceilings come from the first 3 rounds. Like, that's where you get them. And if you don't take them in the first 3 rounds, you're not going to find them in the dead zone. So to your point, all of those names you just listed, you are not giving up a lot to build a running back group from that range. And especially this year, to your point, the actual profiles that are there, Damian Harris and some of those guys could be really interesting. And they're certainly going to at least give you what some of the dead zone backs or some of the other, starters are giving you. Obviously, some of those guys have fallen. Josh Jacobs and Miles Sanders are falling more this year. But because of that, what we're really seeing is just a lot of receivers in the dead zone. And then outside of the receiver window, lots of running backs that are still available. It really does play well for zero RB in terms of that goal of being able to replicate RB points in each of your starting lineups, not necessarily find a top 3 running back, but replicate through various starts. And as you manage the waiver wire, and that's obviously the advantage we have in redraft, that we can pick up players for anyone playing in home leagues or in those setups. I mean, and again, we were talking a lot of the receivers in the 5, 6, and 7, 8 range and reaching up for receivers in home leagues. You don't have to do that. You might be able to get Gabriel Davis in the 5, 6. So you can really build elite receivers when those receivers start to fall. I talked about how Judy went so high in my home league. I did get Gabe Davis at the 4-5 turn. You haven't seen that in weeks in anything high stakes. You can build some really, really strong receivers in the early parts at better prices than what we were discussing as we sort of focused more on main event, and then still hit, maybe some of those running backs get pushed up, but there's so many you just named that are still there in rounds 9, 10, 11, 12, and try to replicate throughout the year running back scoring that isn't that much different than the RB5 overall, the RB3. I think Najee Harris was the RB3 last year, 17.7 points per game. I just wrote a piece, again, might be out by this point for my Stealing Signals subscribers, but talked about Peter Overzet and Eric Beimfor's 8th overall best ball team from last year, where they didn't get to make any moves in their running back room. They basically only had 5 backs because Raheem Mostert played 4 snaps. They had drafted him as their first running back off the board last year. He got hurt. But they had Madison, who I mentioned. He gave them a few peak weeks. They played Tony Pollard's sort of 6 to 10 point weeks very frequently. We're actually just taking those kind of floor games. They weren't quite the 12 to 15 point floor games that we think of, but 6 to 10 points is fine. They had James Conner, who obviously was a really nice anchor for them, but Conner didn't produce late, wasn't healthy. And then they had Rashad Penny and Sony Michel, who did a lot for them late. They combined in half PPR for 30 points per game, just over 30 points per game from their 2 running back slots from that zero RB build, just those 5 backs. Now, obviously, they got the advantage of best ball. At the same time, they got the disadvantage of not being able to make any changes. But they essentially had 15 points from each of their 2 running back slots is what I'm getting at, based on just their total overall scoring in half PPR. And I just said Najee was the RB3 with a 17.7. In half, it was Joe Mixon, 16.8. Najee was down at 15.5. I mean, they were basically right there with both of their running back slots in a 0 RB build where they couldn't make any changes. They couldn't make any waiver transactions. They had 5 guys on their roster. And they were basically right there with both of their 2 spots. The only guys that they weren't really right there with were Taylor and Eckler. That's the whole point, right?
And even beyond that, when we look at the playoffs last season, the top 2 scorers, weeks 15 through 17, Devin Singletary and Rashad Penny, drafters have put them right back in this prime area to select running backs. Justin Jackson was number 4. He did not make the Lions, and I believe is on their practice squad. Sony Michel was number 6. He did not make the Dolphins and has moved over to the Chargers. You look down a little bit further on the list, and the player who actually averaged the most points, Damian Harris, right back in that range. And I just want to say up front, I don't think that the fantasy playoffs are going to work like that this coming season. I don't think that you're going to get that much firepower from running backs who are in this group at this range. But it is interesting after we've just seen this happen that there's still skepticism, number 1, about some of the specific players who are in great situations again. And then number 2, about putting your team together this way. You mentioned some of the differences between best ball and managed leagues. It's easy to miss just how much value there is from being able to play those guys like a Justin Jackson, who you wrote about in your newsletter and encouraged your subscribers to play in that crucial week.
And to add, he was my favorite widely available ad leading into the playoffs a couple weeks before Eckler even got hurt. But yeah.
We do have some of those great situations in best ball where Devin Singletary, Rashad Penny, and Sony Michel were all on that list. And so then you have them and you end up not cutting them because you're locked into your league. And so there can be some advantages there too, because Rashad Penny obviously cut on a lot of managed teams, was not that active in the main event playoffs, for example, because he was locked in so many leagues because of when he was cut. Then these guys, I think, even though I don't believe that the fantasy playoffs are going to work like that this coming season, I do think that we're going to get some big scores from the guys in the first 3 rounds. This is an accelerating trend, like so many of the trends that work in favor of 0 RB, where we're getting better young wide receiver scoring. We're getting good breakouts for these players to where you can build your roster like this. And the way that the NFL works now is very, very favorable for it.
Absolutely. And when you say that, the way the NFL works, I mean, part of that is just like, more spread offenses, more available options. It has made it so that there are more receivers that are draftable into the later rounds. And yet, when you really dig into that, it's also made it so that the ones that can actually consolidate targets and earn these massive targets per out run rates and massive target shares are that much better, because the secondary receivers aren't, the wide receiver 2 market shares, I haven't looked at this, but I'm guessing sort of league wide are probably either starting to trend down or going to trend down a little bit. I think the wide receiver 1 target shares have as well a little bit overall, because you have more of the pie being taken by the wide receiver 3s and wide receiver 4s. And those are the guys that suddenly make wide receiver seem like it's deeper. And yet when you get to the ones that can actually truly consolidate a wide receiver 1 target share, you talked about with CeeDee Lamb, if he could be at a 31% target share in the modern NFL, like that, the difference that's going to provide you at wide receiver is actually kind of growing because of the way that so many offenses are more spread. Those true breakouts, the Cooper Kupp season from last year was so advantageous for obvious reasons. He scored a ton of points, but also because we're just, we're getting these sort of, legendary receiver seasons now in the way that we do with running back a little bit. And we're also seeing more offenses every year be running back by committee and those types of things, and try different things at running back. It's been, an ebb and flow there. There was a few years where there's the obvious passing down backs. Now the league seems to be more aware that they were tipping their hand on whether they were throwing or running. And so they want to kind of keep some players on the field more. But now we're seeing some teams that are basically telling us that they're going to alternate drives to keep running backs fresh, keep them in there, and they can play on all 3 downs, but they're not going to play the full workload like the early 2000s backs that were 400 touch guys. We're not really seeing that as much. Anyway, that creates these opportunities where, like you talked about Damian Harris and Ramondre Stevenson, that's a team where we're kind of expecting that they might be playing alternating drives and playing on all three downs. Both of them are very viable to play in 0 RB builds at their prices. The Bill Belichick hate running backs thing it's been true for so long, but we're at this point now where I want to target both of his running backs. So we have a lot of options there as well. And at the prices you can get them, suddenly the opportunity cost isn't what it is when you're taking running backs higher and you're having to give up potentially elite wide receivers and you have to give up the elite tight end or the elite quarterback. You can still get the running back points after all the other positions have hit these huge tier breaks. And at running back, it's pretty flat from the start of the dead zone all the way to that range. And it's including that range. And you're grabbing these Devin Singletaries and Rashad Pennies that are, are they different than Ezekiel Elliott? I don't think they're that much different than the guys that are going at the back end of, round 3, early round 4, and you're talking about the start of the dead zone. So,
and I don't want this to sound like a criticism of Nick Chubb, because I have immense respect for how good he is as a running back. He is phenomenal. You look at his advanced stats, just his rushing ability is crazy. Another player who's very good in that area, hasn't done it at nearly the sample, but is very good, and this was his profile coming out, which is one of the reasons we're not completely shocked that he's very good, is Rashad Penny, who, especially now that the Browns look like they're going to have a train wreck of an offense and Chubb has these elite options behind him, it just seems almost clear cut that even if you didn't know the prices, you would prefer Rashad Penny. Now, again, Chubb is so good and has done it for a longer period of time. I'm not pushing that argument, but the difference in price is very substantial. The other thing that I would mention there, and you've done some cool work, answered some questions in your Substack about the differences between best ball and managed leagues and what that means for 0 RB. I would encourage anybody who's interested to subscribe and check that out. But as you were talking through that about how the wide receiver position works and how difficult it is to find these starters, we do get this narrative out there from time to time that some of these things that we talk about will work in best ball, but they're suboptimal in redraft. And you think through the different points and you can see how it's just glaringly not the case. The thing that best ball proved is that wide receiver isn't deep. And even if you have an optimized lineup and a lot of wide receivers, it will not get you the wide receiver points you need to win.
Yeah.
That is exaggerated in managed leagues. So if you want to have the power teams, then you have to have some kind of contingency-based draft that gives you the pathway to have a league-winning lineup.
Yeah, if you look at the different, construction research that's been done in best ball and just shows time and time again that basically as many wide receivers as you can fit onto your roster, you want to do, because it's going to help you, because it is a very volatile position. And it's going to continue to elevate win rates, right? Like it's going to actually be a positive to keep throwing more and more and more receivers in there to try to get that right mix, even in a best ball format of, where you're getting the points and how you're getting them. You don't see that phenomenon with running back because, you can't. Essentially, it's running back versus receiver. And when you do that at running back, you're losing the receivers and you're not getting the points on either side. And can be pretty devastating. And so I think that you mentioned best ball, I would go to DFS, where for years, the sharpest DFS people have talked about wide receivers are a lot more volatile. And because of that, they're willing to eat the chalk, the high played options at running back, because they're more likely to hit their projection in a given week and play more contrarian receivers at times. We, on a weekly level, are pretty good at predicting running back volume. The issue is we're not good at it on a season level. So you have to be flexible at that position, and you can build out your points throughout the season based on the way that the chaos of an NFL season allows opportunity at running back. As you just described it, the playoff scoring last year, it was a 3-week stretch where it was really emphasized. It probably won't be like that this year, but last year it was very emphasized in that 3-week stretch where basically none of the top 10 round running backs that were drafted were competing with, Rashad Penny and Sony Michel and Devin Singletary, who were guys that were going significantly later. I guess in Singletary's case, probably right around round 10 last year. But anyway, on a weekly level, as you play this weekly game throughout the season, you can get that at running back. And again, in DFS, it's more predictable that given week who's going to be the good running back plays. Wide receiver is challenging, other than the very elite ones. And then, in DFS, it becomes a price issue. But Cooper Kupp last year, people were paying tons of money to play. Because when you get to that player, you want him in your lineup any way you can, right? And so there are only a few receivers that are like that are worth playing into in that type of a DFS format. And there's a lot more that goes into that. But I think that's it. As well as what you said with best ball, another way to think about the weekly game that we play